Yeah. Okay, great. So the next speaker is Virginia Valian. She's Distinguished Professor of Psychology at Hunter College. Thanks so much for being here.
Thank you. This is going to be interactive, I hope, and I need to start by repeating something that I once read that a professor said to his class. I don't want anybody who knows the answer to answer. So if you already know exactly what's what and you're not guessing, then don't raise your hand or call out the answer. I want it to be the case that people who are uncertain are the people who are going to reply, because that will then tell us what everybody knows and doesn't know. So let's see how it works. Maybe all of you know everything and we can go to lunch early. All right, so I'm going to start off with terms to know that you may or may not already know. So the first term is independent variable and levels of a variable. So what is an independent variable? Yeah.
It's the variable you manipulate in the course of the experiment.
Okay, do you have to manipulate it? Does an independent variable have to be a variable that you manipulate?
No, it could be the kind of samples you choose.
Okay, so it could be sex, for example, or race, or any one of a number of things. Ideally, in a true experiment, it's the variable that you manipulate the levels of. So when we talk about levels of a variable, pick a variable and tell me what levels it might have. Try to pick a variable that has more than one level.
Education.
Okay, and what levels might there be?
Low, medium, high.
Okay, so you might divide it into 3 levels. You might make even finer gradations, and depending on the kind of analysis that we were going to do, we might make those gradations very fine, or we might pick subjects so that they were in one or another of our 3 categories. Okay, great. And dependent variable. So what's a dependent variable? Nobody who answered before can answer. You.
It's the variable you want to try to look at the result. Is it be influenced by your something like that?
Okay, so it's the variable whose effect you're measuring. So you're looking to see, does this variable change as a function of variables in your independent variable? Now, it might seem simple. I get papers to review in which people do not seem to know the difference between an independent variable and a dependent variable. They treat their dependent variable so everybody gets the independent variable part right, but they sometimes treat their dependent variable as if it were an independent variable. That is, they use different levels of their dependent variable as if they were levels of an independent variable. So that's a mistake that even professionals can make. Okay, operational definition. What's an operational definition? And why do operational definitions matter? You.
So you take something that you want to study, but it's not clear exactly what it is. But if you want to test for it, you have to be able to just stipulate that if something meets certain conditions, then that's what we'll call it. So if you want to measure happiness, see how many times a subject smiles or something. That would be an operational definition of happiness.
Okay, so you might be interested in happiness and you might take smiling as your measure of happiness. And all the time what we're doing is taking some theoretical construct like intelligence or interest in philosophy, and we're deciding what's going to count as a measure of that. And we can be wrong in what we say is a good measure of it. So maybe IQ tests aren't a good measure of intelligence. Depends what you think intelligence is. So these three things are the critical parts of any experiment. Okay, what's the difference between the experimental group and the control group?
Oh, me?
Yeah.
Those are the people who's like, you haven't really manipulated, right?
Okay, so the control group is the group to which you treat identically to the experimental group, except with respect to the manipulation that you are controlling. At least you hope that you're treating the control group identically to the experimental group in every way except for the manipulation that you're controlling. So, can anybody think of an example of an experiment that has an experimental group and a control group? Yes?
Well, the acetaminophen study we just looked at, you have
Okay.
a group that's taken acetaminophen and then the group that has taken nothing at all.
Okay, so usually that group has taken something, it's taken a placebo, so that we've kept everything constant. That is, we've made it the case that everybody's taking something even. But one group has the pill that actually has the, we hope, effective ingredient in it, and the other group has taken something that's inert. Sometimes it's not, never mind. Okay, experimenter bias and experimenter demand. These are things that are very important in social psychology experiments especially, but not only. So does anybody know what these are? Or want to take a guess at what these are? Go ahead.
So it's experiments bias, that's the reason you might want a double-blind trial, right? The idea that, for example, when evaluating whether a subject has improved at a given test has improved with respect to the dependent variable. If you know they've had a placebo, then you might think, oh, they can't possibly have improved, so you call that.
Yes, so one experiment where this has come up as an issue, and by the way, those of you who are sort of far away from here, if you don't hear something, just raise a finger so that I'll repeat it. There's an experiment that's become very well known now. The first author, Cannon, and Baron Cohen. I always forget whether it's Cohen Baron or Baron Cohen. People should never have their names as far as I'm concerned. It's a message to everybody before you get too attached to somebody. Just stay how you are, because then people can remember you. So in this experiment, which they did with babies, they had male and female babies, and they presented those babies either with an actual face, namely the face of the experimenter in real life, or with a picture that was then put on a three-dimensional object that consisted of that experimenter's facial features in the wrong places. So an eye might be here, and an ear might be here, and a nose might be here. And the question was what babies, male and female babies, preferred to look at. Did they prefer to look at the face of the experimenter, or did they prefer to look at the at this three-dimensional object, which for some unknown reason they called a mobile, but it was not a mobile, it was like something on a stick. Okay, so forget about what the results were, because we're not going to go into the statistics of that. If the experimenter knew the sex of the baby that she was putting her head in front of, that could affect how she put her head in front of the baby and what kind of facial expression she had, even if she was trying to be neutral. So you've probably heard of Rosenthal's Pygmalion experiments. This was from the 60s, maybe even, where teachers are told at the beginning of the semester that some particular set of students has been identified as likely to make a lot of progress during the school year. And in fact, those students who were randomly chosen did make a lot of progress during the school year. So in ways that we don't know that we're acting toward people, we can create unwittingly, we're trying to do our best, but we can nevertheless affect the likelihood that we'll get one response or another. In experiments that I've done, so I do research on language acquisition, I've done both a video version and an in-person version, and the video version, the results are not nearly as strong as the results are when we do it in person. I think it's partly because being in person, you're actually engaging the child and it's more interesting to the child, but it could be that despite our best efforts, we're also giving the child some clue about which thing we want the child, which picture or which scenario we want the child to pick, and when we give the same video to every child, that can't happen. So sometimes these things that we do in order to make an experiment something that somebody wants to undergo, like with children, having somebody in person is actually more captivating than having that same person on a video, may also introduce other things that we'd rather not have be there. And what about experimenter demand? Yeah. Great. I'm so glad. Okay. So experimenter demand occurs when the subject of the experiment has an idea of what it is that we want the results to be because of how we have set the experiment up. So we have to be really clever when we set these experiments up that we don't tip the subject off to what it is that we want from them. That we don't indicate to them, we want you to act this way rather than another way. And a feature that can happen that is not exactly experimenter demand, it's more like culture demand. People know what responses are socially desirable and what responses are not socially desirable, and by and large, they want to make socially desirable responses. So we have to be clever in devising the stimuli that either people don't have a view about what's socially desirable or we're able to get around that. And people who make up tests in part based on what they think about social desirability. So when I was in college and I took a psychometrics class, and there was one, and we took all the tests that we discussed, and on one test my results were deemed unreliable because on the lie scale I scored very high. And being an exceptionally honest person, I was shocked by this. And it turned out that the lie scale had items in it like, I always use a napkin when I eat. Well, I do always use a napkin when I eat, but apparently most people do not. And so if you say that you always use a napkin when you eat, you're a liar. And someone else I know was also deemed a liar because another such question was, when I look at the newspaper, I read the editorial page first. And he did read the editorial page first, and he was then scoring on the lie scale because the people who make these up think, perhaps know, that people don't read the editorial page first. All right, so these, yeah.
I just wanted to ask quickly on an experiment demand. I take it that subjects in any experiment are always going to be trying to figure out what's going on. The problem is when their guesses are actually correct, right?
Yes, although you want them to be buying whatever your cover story is. And we'll talk about an experiment further down that has a fairly elaborate cover story, which probably subjects did buy. And that's why people do manipulation checks at the end of the experiment. So you look to see, did people think the experiment was about what you said it was about, or did they think it was about something different? Because indeed, they might alter their responses depending on what they think you're getting at. Okay, within design, between design, match design, and factorial design. Okay, I'm assuming most of you don't know what this refers to, so I'm just going to tell you. In a within subjects design, the same subject undergoes multiple levels, all the levels typically, of whatever the independent variable is. So let's say you're doing a study in which you are giving children different kinds of sentences to imitate, just to pick something at random. So you're giving them sentences to imitate that have referential subjects, or that have pronominal subjects, or that have expletive pronominal subjects like the it in "it seems hot in here." And you're giving them sentences that have past tense in them. And you're giving them, some of the sentences are short sentences and some of the sentences are long sentences. And in that design, a given subject is getting every single level of the variable. They're getting short sentences and long sentences. They're getting sentences with referential subjects, pronominal subjects, and expletive subjects. They're getting everything that we could throw at them. In a between subjects design, some subjects might get short sentences and other subjects might get long sentences. So we divide up the levels of our variable to the different subject groups that we have. And we do different statistical tests depending on whether it's a within design or a between design. In yet other cases, we may have a matched design, in which case we are matching the subjects in one group with the subjects in another group. So take the case, the acetaminophen experiment. We want to be sure that the subjects in the control group are very similar to the subjects in the experimental group. Usually we just randomly assign subjects, but we might have reasons to think that there are special properties that we want to be sure are matched between the two groups. So we might want to make sure that the two groups have similar proportions of males and females, because we think that gender could affect responses to drugs. We might want to make sure that we have similar ethnic composition between the groups and so on. So we sometimes try to match subjects so that the groups won't differ on any properties other than the action of our independent variable. Okay, now, oh yeah.
I was just wondering, is one of the motivations for a between design to overcome experimenter demand problems? I guess I'm wondering, like, if you were to try to test for bias, where if you did it within design, that people would start to realize, well, that's what they're looking for. I don't want to look biased, so I'm going to change my responses.
Yes, so that can be one reason. Sometimes it's just an experiment will be too long.
Okay.
If you subject a subject to every level
20 different levels
of
or
the
something,
variable.
yeah.
Let's say you're doing a dose experiment with a drug. You could do it within, maybe, but that might take you a hugely long period of time, because you'd have to wait for people to recover from the first dose, and you'd have to determine what order were you going to put those various doses in, and so then it's much simpler just to have one group per dosage.
So sometimes it's just a practical problem.
Sometimes it's just practical. and sometimes the practical thing can go the other way. You can't get enough, like with children. Typically, you're lucky if you see them once, and so you may have, and children are pretty variable, so you don't try to do things that extend over multiple visits, and you try, so I've run some experiments. At the very end, if we have time, I'll tell you about one of them, a priming experiment where one group of children gets one set of primes and another group of children gets another set of primes, even though when you do it in the adult literature, both kinds of primes that you're giving, say active voice and passive voice, all the subjects get. But that's because you can put in 70 fillers along with the ones you're interested in, and you can test people in an hour and have hundreds of sentences. But with children, you're lucky that you get 8 sentences plus the primes. And so then you have 2 different groups and you do it as a between experiment, even though you might like to do it as a within experiment. So it usually is practical issues, but the kind of thing that you're mentioning is also an issue. Okay, so you're reading through journals and you want to know what it is that people did. So the ideal title tells you what the independent and the dependent variable are. They don't come labeled IV, DV, but they're written in such a way that you can get that information. Okay, the morning morality effect, the influence of time of day on unethical behavior. All right, I picked the clearest one first. What's the independent variable and what's the dependent variable in that study?
The independent variable would be the time of day, and the dependent variable would be the ethical or unethical behavior.
Right, okay, great. So we don't know, whoops, I was too clever by half there. So we don't know from this how many different times of day they're looking at, but time of day is pretty straightforward. Unethical behavior, well, we know there could be a jillion different operational definitions of unethical behavior, but that's the that is the construct that's serving as the dependent variable. Okay. Stereotype threat can both enhance and impair older adults' memory. All right, what's the independent variable and what's the dependent variable? Who haven't I called on you?
So I think the independent variable would be stereotype, and the independent variable would be older adults' memory.
Okay, great. So again, we don't know. Yes, I will learn in time. We don't know exactly what the manipulation is that they're going to be using to induce stereotype threat, but given that they're looking at older adults, we can presume that the stereotype threat is going to be related to age in some way. And then memory, we don't know whether they're going to be measuring long-term memory, working memory, what kind of memory, but it's some kind of memory that they're going to be looking at in older adults. Older adults, we actually do not know what people think older adults are. So in some studies, older adults are people who are 40 because RTs start getting longer at about age 21. So in our bilingualism studies, for example, we only use subjects who are between 18 and 25 because we don't want those old people, those people over 25 with their long RTs messing up what's going on. Yeah.
So just inside of this, am I right in thinking that the age of the subjects itself could be an independent variable here if it was a factorial or something?
Yes, it could be. Exactly. Good. Okay, now, disgust sensitivity predicts intuitive disapproval of gaze. So what's the independent and dependent variable here?
Discuss sensitivity is the independent variable.
Right, now from this title, we don't necessarily know what discussed sensitivity is. We don't know if it's referring to food or what. Okay, and the dependent variable?
Is intuitive disapproval of gaze.
Intuitive disapproval of gaze. So again, we don't know exactly how that's being measured, and that study has a co-author who is in this room. Okay, moral self-license. So all the ones we've had so far have told us more or less what the independent and dependent variables are in the title. Moral self-licensing, when being good frees us to be bad. It's a great title, right? But I don't think we can tell very much from that title what the independent and dependent variables are. That is, so the other ones gave us the construct, they weren't specific about it, but we had enough feel for the construct that we could sort of tell, okay, memory, we know memory comes in various varieties, older, okay, we've got some idea of what that is. Here, the authors are introducing a term. How many people have heard of moral self-licensing? Okay, so it's not a very well-known term. So we don't know what it is. And then when being good frees us to be bad. So what's our best guess here about what the independent and dependent variables are? I actually know this experiment, so I know the answer, but I don't know if I'd be able to tell just from reading the title. Yeah, you want to
I'm going to guess that
Okay.
the independent variable is some measure of perceived good actions that one performs, and the dependent variable is one's license to perform maybe not good actions in light of those good actions. This is
Okay.
somewhat personal as well, so I do that.
Okay, so in fact, yes, what the experimenters manipulate is people's, so they create a situation in which they really push people so that they'll make a decision that looks like a good decision. They have to choose between a male or a female for some job, and the female is strikingly better qualified for the job than the male is, and it's a neutral, it's not a sex-based, sex-type job, and people choose that person. So they've done the right thing, they've picked the woman. In the control condition, they don't have, they don't do that. Then they have to, make another decision about a case where it's not clear whether you should hire the male or the female. And in the condition where people have overwhelmingly picked the female, and they also have a condition in which, different one in which people pick the black person, when it's a little more ambiguous, then people feel free to pick the man, for example, for the job. So you're free to make a morally questionable decision if you feel free to make a morally questionable decision if you've previously reassured yourself by having made what looks to you like a good decision. Although really, what was so good about picking the best person for the job? Nothing much, yeah.
So in that experiment, who was the control group? Did you have to...
The control group didn't get this prior setup in which you...
Okay, they didn't get it.
Right. Okay, but so this is a title that attracts us, but it doesn't really tell us very much about what the independent and dependent variables are. And then we have the epistemic side effect. Does anybody have a clue what the independent and dependent variables are for this? Okay, so this is a fairly, again, it's a title that appeals to us, but it's pretty opaque as far as what it's about. So, I mean, it does tell us there's a side effect. Good luck. Okay. Now, here's so you can tell, so when you're reading titles, you can tell what they're about. You can identify, in large part, especially if it's a psychology article, what the independent and dependent variables are. Okay, so now here's a study I'm making up. It looks at males and females, blacks and whites, training of none, 1, 2, or 3 sessions, and so this is training in hiring, and then it looks at, and the people who are being trained are males and females, blacks and whites. They either get no training, 1 training session, 2, or 3, and then the investigators look at the extent to which males and females are hired in some institution or organization over a 5-year period. All right, is this an experiment? Not everything is an experiment. Some things are studies. In experiments, you control the independent variable. So is this an experiment? This is a trick question because you think it has to be a trick question, but it's not a trick question. Okay, and you were going to say, yes, it's an experiment because we're manipulating the independent variable with none, 1, 2, or 3 sessions. So it's a real experiment. We've manipulated the independent variable. So a different kind of study could just be, let's get some data, forget about the training, we just look at the hiring of males and females over a 5-year period. And we might want to know that. And there our independent variable might be something like departments. So English departments, chemistry departments, etc. Are they hiring males and females to the same extent over a 5-year period? So that wouldn't be an experiment, but it would be a study, and we might be interested in the results. All right, now, in the results sections that you'll read, you'll often see as one of the first statements in the results section, this 2x3x4 design, ... All right, so in a 2x3x4 design, how many variables are there? Let's see. 3, exactly. Good. And how did you determine that? Right. So there are 3 numbers, and each of those numbers stands for an independent variable. And how many levels are there for each of these variables? So it's a kind of trick question the way I phrased it. So somebody who can unpack it, yeah.
2 levels for the first variable, 3 for the second, 4 for the third.
Exactly. Okay, great. So what the, however many numbers there are tells you how many variables there are, and then the identity of each number tells you the number of levels for that variable. So, does any, oh yes, how many main effects are there? So when you do the statistics for this experiment, you're going to be looking for how many main effects. This wasn't covered in your assignment, so you may not know. Great, okay, excellent. So there's one main effect for each of the variables, all right? So for each of the independent variables, you're going to be looking to see, was there an effect of that variable, independent of the other variables? So if we go back for a moment to this slide, this is the way we would, what's on the next slide is how we would schematize this study. We have males and females in our study. We have blacks and whites in our study. No, sorry, I needed to have blacks, whites, and Hispanics. And training, 1, 2, or 3 sessions, yes, okay. So if I'd done it right, and I apologize for not, this would be 2 sexes, and this would be 3 ethnic groups, and this would be the 4 levels of our actual manipulation. So we can ask, is there a difference in how males and females respond in this study, regardless of what their ethnic identity is, and regardless of how much training they got? Do we have straight up a difference between males and females? And for the second main effect, ethnic identity, we can ask, is there a difference in how the 3 ethnic groups respond, independent of gender and independent of training? And then finally, we can ask about our training independent of sex and independent of ethnic group. So is there a difference among our different levels of training? So there are 3 main effects because there are 3 independent variables. All right, so we always have one main effect per variable. Now, interactions. So training might not work the same way for males and females. It might not work the same way for the different ethnic groups. There might be what experimenters call an interaction. So it could be training works one way for whites and it works a different way for blacks and Hispanics, or, we don't know. So interaction effects tell us whether there are any differences like that. And interactions are a function of the number of variables. So if you have just one variable, there cannot be an interaction because all you've got is one variable and that's it. If you have 2 variables, now we can talk about interactions. So if we had only 2 variables, how many interactions can there be? I'm not sure I've told you enough so that you can do more than guess, but guess. 2, great. Why do you say that?
The first variable is back on the second, and the second variable is back on the first.
Okay, now if only I could draw a graph, which I can't because we do, except 90% of the room won't be able to see it. Okay. So this is variable 1, and let's say that variable 1 has 2 levels, and let's say we're measuring here, I don't know, % compliance with something or other.
Fully delivered?
Oh, great idea, okay. Now the other 70% of them won't be able to see it, that's fine, okay. Okay, so we've got 2 levels of variable 1, and we've got variable 2. Let's say variable 2 is no training, let's make this no training. And make this training. And we've got males and females. Okay, so what could happen is that females are very compliant, not to be biased in any way, whether they get training or no training. Males, on the other hand, are extremely non-compliant without training, but they're very good learners, and so they're compliant after training, okay? Okay, now, in this situation, now, we have to go back to your comment, which I regret to say was incorrect, because your reasoning was right, it's just you got the wrong answer, as so often happens in life. So what we have here is, we can look at this either in terms of training as a function of sex. Now it's too bad in a way that I chose sex, because outside of certain unusual experiments, we can't change people's sex. But we could also look at sex as a function of training with respect to compliance. So there are these two ways of looking at it. Does variable 1 act the same way regardless of the level of variable 2? Does variable 2 act the same way regardless of the level of variable 1? When we have lines that cross, so the classic interaction is an X, but this also would count as an interaction. There's just one interaction. What the interaction means, what the term interaction means is, you can look at it either in terms of the relationship between X and Y, or the relationship between Y and X. Okay, so do you see why your reasoning was right, but what that results in is one interaction. Does everybody see this? So in this case, it could be that, so let's see, are we in this case going to have a difference between no training and training? So will there be a main effect of training in this case? How would we decide? The way we decide, just roughly, so we haven't done any stats yet, we're just looking at the numbers, which we always want to do. We're looking at the numbers and we're saying, is there likely to be a training effect? Well, if there's a training effect, we're going to be ignoring sex. So we're going to say, okay, let's say we've got equal numbers of males and females, so the mean here is what they're doing, what compliance is with no training. And the mean here is what compliance is with training. All right? So this looks like, I mean, obviously we have to do a statistical test to determine it, but it looks like, yeah, we have an effect of training, forgetting about gender, right? Because overall, ignoring gender, there's more compliance in the training than the non-training condition. Is there a main effect of sex? So how are we going to figure that out? Now we're going to look, okay, what's the average that the female is doing? Well, how nice of them to be right there. And what's the average of what the males are doing? About there, maybe a little higher. again, we don't know for sure until we do the stats, but at least it looks like, yeah, females are doing more of what we want them to do overall, independent of training, than men are. So does everybody see that with respect to the main effects? So we look at the main effects independently in each case of what the other main effects are doing. The interaction looks to see whether those main effects, whichever main effect we're interested in, works the same way for all the levels of the other variable, and vice versa when we've just got two. And in this case, it looks like we've got an interaction because our training doesn't work similarly independent of sex. And in a lot of social psychology experiments, interactions are the main things you've got. It's not always the case, but it's often the case. And in the previous talk, you saw how interactions can be a little problematic. But men and women don't respond the same. Blacks and whites don't always respond the same, and so on.
Can I ask a question?
Yeah,
From the internet?
from the internet,
Yeah.
yes, of course.
From the folks at Pitt?
Oh,
You may be.
wow, okay,
in-
I didn't realize, yeah, okay.
There's a concurrent viewing group
Okay.
at Pittsburgh. You may be coming back to it, but they asked if you could explain a factorial design.
Yes, let's see if I do.
Okay.
Okay. All right, so now for this 2x3x4, how many interactions are we going to get? So we're going to get 4 interactions because we can look at the interaction of that first variable that had 2 levels by the second variable that had 3. We can look at the interaction between the first variable and the third variable. We can look at the interaction between the third variable and the fourth variable. And we can look at the interaction of all 3 variables. And the more variables you have, the more interactions you have, and the more difficult it becomes. So when you've got this kind of interaction, a 3-way interaction, it becomes very, very difficult to visualize, to understand, to know what to make of. And so people often don't want to have an experiment with this many variables in it. So we have 3 2-way interactions and 1 3-way interaction when we've got 3 variables. Okay? Does anybody want to ask a question? Okay. So what requires an operational definition? We've gone through this. What to control for and what not to control for. Especially, but not only by any means, in social psychology experiments, there's the possibility for a lot of confounding variables. So a confounding variable or an extraneous variable is a variable that is correlated with one of your independent variables, and you may not realize that it is. And it could be driving the effect instead of your independent variable. And subject variables are often things that you have to be concerned about. So it could be that unbeknownst to you, or you weren't thinking about it, you have more males than females in your experimental group compared to your control group. And so your independent variable is correlated with sex, and it could be that sex is driving the effect. Or it could be race, or it could be income, IQ, motivation, height, power. So many of these things actually occur together that it can be very hard to separate them in an experiment. So power differences are often correlated with sex differences. So you can be unsure whether an effect that you're having where you have males and females responding differently, is that because of something about males and females independent of the power differences between them, or is it just the power differences? So to the extent that you can, you hold conditions constant. So you want to control for everything. On the other hand, over-control has its own problems. So in creating psycholinguistic stimuli, for example, you don't want it to be the case that every sentence has the same number of syllables or words, however you decide to equate them, as every other one, because that sets up an incredibly unnatural and repetitive set of stimuli that people are then likely to develop some bias in terms of how they respond. So you want what you're after in the experiment is to get as good a glimpse of what happens in real life as possible. So here, in the case of sentences, you want to have a lot of fillers around that do a lot of different things so that you're engaging people's normal, whatever that might be, sentence processing mechanisms. So a good experimenter knows what things to have freely vary and what things to really tightly control for. So when things freely vary, as long as they're not freely varying more for one condition than another condition, all you've done is create noise, and you hope that your effect is big enough to rise above the noise. But if you, noise you can do something about. Bias, if you've biased things in one way or another, then you've got just a terrible setup. So you don't want bias and you don't want noise, but you also want people not to be adopting particular strategies for the purpose of getting through your experiment. And so over-control, making all your stimuli very, very much like each other, has its own problems. I am going to skip this because we don't have time, even though it's very entertaining. Okay, so here's an example of a confounding variable. So the question is bottle feeding or breastfeeding more associated with diarrhea in infants? The hypothesis that you would have is bottle feeding is more likely to lead to diarrhea because it's more prone to contamination. And therefore, you'll get more diarrhea. However, there's less diarrhea in bottle-fed babies. So why is that? Well, it turns out there's a confounding variable, namely the level of the mother's education. So more highly educated mothers tend to use bottles more, and more highly educated mothers are also mothers who can manage to have very sanitary conditions. So here's a case where you might not have thought of that as a possible confounding variable. So a whole bunch of things here can be extraneous variables that you need to control for. Oops. So in a certain number of cases where people look to see, has some treatment been effective? Well, some people just get better. You didn't do anything, but they just get better. You want to have placebo or nocebo control. There are practice effects. You get better over time doing something, and there are fatigue effects. You get tired over time of doing things. There's unequal attrition, which tells you one of your groups, there's something about your manipulation that makes people drop out of one of your groups more than another group. And so if you then get differences between those two groups, you don't know whether it's because of what you thought was the case, or because you only got a select group in one of your two groups. Frequency differences among materials. This is an unbelievable headache for psycholinguists because word frequency affects almost everything, and balancing frequency is yet another pain that you've got to do. Knowledge of manipulation, someone already brought this up, social desirability, we talked about that. Now, here is the thing that, in my limited experience, I think is most crucial for experimentation, looking at philosophical intuitions and other things. And that is, whatever you do, you have to have a lot of items. Every item has its own idiosyncrasies. If you only use one item, or if you only use two items, you don't know whether differences that you're getting on that item, like sex differences that you might be getting, or level of education differences that you might be getting, have to do with the idiosyncrasies of that item or have to do with things that you think that item actually demonstrates. So participants are a random effect. You wouldn't dream of running just one subject because you know participants vary. Similarly, items are a random effect. You can't ever use just one item because items vary. So you want to be sure that the conclusions that you're drawing hold not just across the sample of subjects that you've got, but across the sample of items that you've got. Okay. Then there's faulty reasoning, which of course none of you would ever be subject to. But it happens a lot that people infer causation from correlation. And one possibility is there's no causal connection at all. There's some third variable or other variables that are responsible. Another thing people do is often consider only one possible direction that the causal arrow could run in instead of also thinking about it in the other direction. And it matters what you do here because that is going to affect what later experiments you do. Are you going to do something that's going to allow you to find out what the cause of some correlation that you have is? So I've got a couple of these design briefs. So these are descriptions of experiments that there's something wrong with. Let's do this first one. This is easy, but people don't always see even things that are easy. Okay, so a researcher investigated the effects of hunger on aggression in cats. She took 10 cats, she kept them in individual cages, she put them on a food deprivation schedule such that the cats weighed 80% of their normal weight at the end of 2 weeks. And people who work with rats and cats and so on often do that sort of thing so that you can increase motivation. She then put the cats in pairs for 15 minutes and tabulated instances of aggression and fighting. In all cases, the cats showed the threat posture, and in most cases, fighting occurred. Conclusion, hunger increases aggression in rats. Okay, I said this was easy, so yeah.
From what I can see, there's no control group.
There is no control group. Okay, so this, we don't know, maybe you put two cats together who haven't known each other and they adopt a threat posture and start fighting. So you just don't know. So you need a control group. Okay. I love this one. An experimenter took 20 subjects who said they believed in astrology, gave them their horoscopes for the previous day, and asked them how accurate on a 6-point scale the horoscopes had been. All 20 subjects reported their horoscopes as accurate to some degree. The experimenter concluded that horoscopes are accurate. Sorry about the missing A in there. Okay, so it's obvious what's wrong with this. how would you make it better? How should this experiment be done? So I'm going to call on you. Yeah.
I'm not sure.
Okay, let's pick who hasn't. Okay, go ahead.
You could give them a random horoscope for a different day or a different sign for
Right.
like half of the subject.
Okay, so you can have, of these 20 subjects, you can give half their horoscopes from the previous day, and you could give half of them somebody else's horoscope.
Give them all
And
the same.
what?
Or give them all the same.
Or you could give them all the same horoscope. So there are a lot of ways that you could do it so that it would be okay. This is obviously not okay. This one's a little more complicated, so I'm not gonna go through it. Instead, we're gonna walk through an actual study, which you may have read, power posing. Brief, nonverbal displays affect neuroendocrine levels and risk tolerance by Carney, Cuddy, and Yap. So they have a sample of 42, 26 females, 16 males. They're randomly assigned to a high or a low power pose. And here the experimenters tell them the following story, that they're looking at the science of physiological recordings. And so they're looking about how placement of electrodes above and below the heart might influence data collection. And so they have to put these people in different poses so that they'll get appropriate recordings. So the experimenter poses the participants, telling them they need to be in a certain position. The participants held 2 poses for 1 minute each. And then afterward, they measured risk-taking with a gambling task, and they measured feelings of power with a self-report task, and they measured cortisone and testosterone levels via saliva samples both before and about 20 minutes after the manipulation. So this is the 2 high power poses that they use. Okay, so basically power poses are poses where you're open and expansive and you take up a lot of territory. So they put people in these positions for 1 minute, or this closed position, which is associated with low power. Okay, they did a bunch of controls to make sure that the different poses were equally comfortable and difficult and not painful. They used a completely separate group of subjects to do that. And they found no differences. Risk-taking measures, one was you give the subject $2, you say, okay, you can keep it, or you can roll this die, and if you get any of 3 numbers, you'll get $4. If you don't get any of those 3 numbers, you'll lose your $2. Power feeling, you rate how powerful and in charge you feel on a scale from 1 to 4, and then there are the cortisol and testosterone ratings. Okay, so here's the effect on testosterone. So when you're in, I said I would learn, but that turned out to be false. When you're in the high power group, your which one is this? Your testosterone goes up. When you're in the low power group, your testosterone goes down. And cortisol is the reverse. If you're in the high power group, your cortisol goes down. If you're in the low power group, your cortisol goes up. And then risk-taking, those people who adopted the high power pose, 86% of them took a risk. And in the low power pose, only 60% of them took a risk. And power feeling, the high power people, remember this was a scale of 1 to 4, reported feeling a higher degree of power. Okay, so this was published in Psych. Now, what else might we want to know? I know I ran through this very quickly, but here's what we learned about the study, and I've reported to you the results as they were reported in the paper. What is it we don't know that we'd like to know? Yeah.
Does gender play a role?
Does gender play a role? We have no idea. They did not do a breakdown by gender. They had unequal amounts of males and females, but we cannot tell from this whether gender might have been playing a role. They did do covariates. They put gender in as a covariate for these, but they did not include gender as a variable here. And this is a place where we might think antecedently, yes, there would be a gender difference. Stanton wrote a kind of reply in which he points out that male and female testosterone levels are generally influenced by different stimuli, and so they may not respond to power displays in the same way, and that the source of testosterone increases are also different for males and females. So for males, they primarily come from the testes and the adrenal glands to a lesser extent. For females, it's primarily released by the adrenal glands and ovaries to a lesser extent. If the adrenals were the source in both genders, cortisol should change in the same direction, but you saw it moved in the opposite direction. So we would really like to know more here. And with respect to gender differences in testosterone, this is one of the biggest gender differences there is. This is like the only difference where there is no overlap between the sexes. So males and females are very much the same in almost every way, but with respect to testosterone, no. There's almost no overlap. So gender just didn't play a role here, and it should have. So maybe it'd be the same, but we would want to know, especially if we're going to recommend to women, as Amy Cuddy does in her TED Talk, that women practice for a minute before they're going to give a talk, sitting on a desk with their feet up, or standing in a power pose. So she starts her TED Talk, which is very entertaining, like this. So if we're going to recommend that to women as a way of producing a more assertive and confident speaking style, we should know just how big is this effect, and to what extent now is this effect going to be carried because people think that doing that is going to have that effect. So they're psyching themselves up to be assertive. Maybe they could psych themselves up to be assertive in some completely different way. All right, now I'm going to end with this probably. So you're probably all aware of these experiments that have been done looking at whether there are gender differences in intuitions that people have about philosophy thought experiments. So here's just one example from Holtzman, and you can see that more women are likely to say yes than is the case for men. A higher percentage of women will say yes than men will. Now, let's assume that there was just this one item. We cannot trust this result because it's just one item. So we want to know across what variations in describing these the scenarios, across what variations do we get this kind of gender difference? So how reliable is this finding? To what extent does it matter exactly how we pose the scenario? And some of you might have heard or might have read this study by Edelberg Thompson, and I actually don't know where the stress goes in his name. Namias, thank you. So they critiqued the Stitch and Buckwalter paper, saying basically how many measures were there. So Stitch and Buckwalter detail a number of cases, but that's that number of cases out of how many cases. So how many cases were there where there were no sex differences? So they did a new study looking at undergraduates and arguing that undergraduates in taking philosophy courses were a better sample than an MTurk sample, because these were people who actually might have some interest in philosophy. And they had 23 items. However, we in our critique mode can say these 23 items were unequally distributed across item types and across subjects. So they had 3 for positive deviance, 3 for negative deviance, 3 for positive normal, 3 for negative normal, 2 trolley cases, and then 9 that were scattered across Gettier and a bunch of other examples. And of those 23 comparisons, they found 1 sex difference. So their conclusion was, by and large, it's not the case that men and women have different intuitions with respect to the thought experiments. And that often philosophers themselves disagree about what their intuitions are on some of them. So like the one about you put something on the table and you go take a shower and somebody comes in and the robber comes in and puts a different thing, replaces your watch with a different watch. Do you know that your watch was on the table? And do you know that the book that was on the table is on the table when the cat didn't take it? I mean, there's a lot to talk about there. So even practicing philosophers disagree on some of these. But we don't, even if we wanted to say there was a sex difference, we don't know what the basis for that sex difference is until we probe further. So are the subjects equally buying into the presuppositions of the experiment? So you might think they're buying into it, but are they buying into it? That's why you do manipulation checks. And typically these experiments haven't used manipulation checks. Okay, we're not going to have time for this because it's 12:15, right? And I stop at 12:15. Okay, so I'm going to stop here. This was a whirlwind tour. And I know I didn't let you ask any questions for like the past 15 minutes as I barreled through. So tell me before we stop for lunch whether there's anything that you want to ask about that I did cover.
There was the one question.
Right, yeah, I'm not going to get into that.
Okay. I have one more internet question.
Okay.
I think that, I'm just trying to read it. If it's possible, maybe we can just do this after everybody leaves. They weren't able to see the blackboard.
Oh, I'm sorry.
So maybe
okay.
we can pull it back over and you can just sort of
afterward. Sure. Okay. Okay, so I hope you're in a better position now to read the parts of the psychology papers that you normally do not read. So I know that you normally do not read the methods section and the results section because you don't know what's going on in them, but it's only through reading the method and the results that you know whether you can trust the conclusions that people are drawing in the discussion section. So like you, I tend to read, well, we may not read the discussion section first. I do tend to read the discussion section first because the first paragraph of the discussion recapitulates the results. So I want to know what the story is, and that's where I'm going to find the story. And then later on, there'll be a summary paragraph somewhere. But then I have to read the method and the results in order to know, is this a justified conclusion? So for that Cuddy et al., Carney-Cuddy experiment, I really would like to believe this, but I don't believe it yet because I don't think they did the gender breakdown that I need to see in order to believe it. And from reading their discussion, you would have no idea that they didn't do that. So you have to read the results and the method. I'm sorry, I know that they're incredibly boring. But you have to read them in order to evaluate what's in the discussion section. Okay, thank you.